Hello and welcome back to the Realonomics channel. My name is Kareem, and in my last video I stated that prices were the thing that relate the amount of money in an economy to the amount of goods and services that are exchanged for money in that economy. But I feel that that claim needs a little bit more explaining. In the 1980s, the Thatcher government adopted monetarist economics and then quietly abandoned it because they found that they couldn't control the money supply using interest rates. And so the idea became discredited and it's been ignored by economists ever since. But what if they were just using the wrong tool? For instance, you can't use a hammer to drive in screws, but that doesn't mean that screws themselves are a bad idea. And I agree that you can't control the money supply using interest rates. But what if there's a tool that can control the money supply? Monetarism is based around what is thought to be the oldest idea in economics, which is known as the quantity theory of money. And despite the complicated jargon-sounding name, it's actually a really simple concept. It dates back as far as 1517, when Nicolaus Copernicus said, "Money usually depreciates in value when it becomes too abundant." Since Copernicus's time, the quantity theory of money has been discussed by such great thinkers as John Stuart Mill, John Locke, Irving Fisher, Milton Friedman, and even John Maynard Keynes accepted the quantity theory of money in principle, although he felt that it only applied over the long run. And he also believed that the demand for money was determined by the price of money, which we know as interest rates. So what does this quantity theory of money actually say? Well, I'd start off by saying it's not really a theory at all. It's an identity, and an identity is something that is, by definition, true. It's no more controversial than saying X equals X or Bob equals Bob. Or in this case, what we're talking about is nominal GDP equals nominal GDP. You see, every transaction has two sides. Imagine that I buy from you 10 widgets at £5 each. So that means I'm going to give to you £50. And in return, you're going to give me 10 widgets worth £5 each. We can value that transaction one of two ways. We can add up the amount of money that changed hands, which is on the one hand £50, and we can also add up the value of all the things that changed hands, which is quantity of 10 multiplied by price of 5 comes to £50 when you calculate it that way. So what we've stated is nominal GDP in terms of money that changed hands is equal to nominal GDP in terms of the value of the things that changed hands, which gives us a neat way to express what's going on in the economy. It's the quantity theory of money, which states that MV, which is the amount of money that exists, multiplied by the velocity of money, or the number of times that money changed hands in a year, is equal to the total output of the economy, Y, multiplied by the price level. So what the quantity theory of money is just saying that the amount of money that swapped hands is equal to the amount of goods that swapped hands. Pretty straightforward, right? Now, an example of the power of the quantity theory of money was neatly provided to us by Professor Steve Hanke of Johns Hopkins University in America, who appeared on the Wealthy On YouTube channel in August 2021. And he made a prediction that inflation would top out at 9% in June 2022. If you recall, that was when we were having this rapid explosion in inflation following all the COVID lockdowns. Now, the interviewer asked Hanke, "How do you get to that prediction?" And Hanke replied, "Simple. It's the quantity theory of money. That's it." How did his prediction fare? Well, in the US, the CPI peaked at 9.1% in June of 2022. Hanke wasn't just correct, he was absolutely on the money. Now, you only make predictions in public if you're comfortable with being wrong, because it's really hard predicting the future. And so when somebody makes a prediction that turns out to be accurate, you have to take seriously their model for understanding the world. Hanke wasn't right by accident. He was right because the quantity theory of money has captured something accurately about the world, that it's a good way of understanding the economy. Not only that, but Hanke's prediction was made 9 months in advance. He was right over the short term, which is to say that the quantity theory of money exerted itself in the short term, proving Keynes wrong. It's not just a long-run phenomenon only. All that said, not all economists are convinced by the quantity theory of money. One eminent Oxford economist asked me, well, what determines whether an increase in the money supply flows into either output or prices? Others observe that, yes, we've seen that the money supply has been increasing much faster than the output of goods and services, even as prices remained flat, which, when you plug those numbers into the equation, must mean that velocity of money is falling. But we think of V as a constant, so this seems to invalidate the theory. Well, these objections bring us to the work of Richard Werner and his disaggregated theory of credit. You see, the monetarists were partly right, but they needed more to complete the picture. What Werner teaches us about is the importance of money creation, which happens through bank lending, and also where the new money flows to, because the economy isn't just one thing. There are different actors in the economy, there's different pools of money. So broadly, there are three categories of people who might borrow money from banks. The first category is people who buy assets. And within that, we've got two groups, people who buy houses and people who buy financial assets. In the 1970s, before financial deregulation, if you wanted to get a mortgage to buy a house, you had to go to a building society. And building societies were constrained by regulations. They didn't have the right to create new money. Building societies could only lend existing money, money that had first been deposited with them by a saver. That severely constrained the amount of money that could be used to purchase houses. And so houses remained very stable and very affordable. In fact, up until the 1970s, the average house cost just 3 times the average income, and it had been that way for years. However, once financial deregulation happened, banks were allowed to start lending mortgages, and banks create new money when they lend. So this led to a growth in the amount of money that was available for house buyers to purchase houses. But at any moment in time, the amount of houses available to buy is fixed. So that meant you had rapid growth in the amount of money available to buy houses, but a fixed supply of houses, and that dislocation had to end up in prices. And that is what we've seen ever since house prices took off since financial deregulation in the late 70s and the early 80s. I don't think I have to sell this argument too much to you. You've seen it for yourself. The other group of people who buy assets is people who buy financial assets. Now, that's not the likes of you and me. That tends to be financial institutions such as hedge funds who can borrow money from banks, and then they can go into the financial markets and they can use that to buy bonds or shares or whatever financial instruments they're interested in buying. And again, at any moment in time, the amount of financial assets available to buy is fixed. And so if you see a rapidly increasing amount of money flowing to people who buy assets, you'll see asset prices go up. Okay, this brings us to the second category of borrowers, which is people who buy goods and services, otherwise known as consumers, the likes of you and me. Now, if we go to a bank and get a credit card and use that to buy goods and services, then that increase in trade in goods and services increases GDP, up to the point at which the economy reaches full capacity. Firms are selling everything that they can produce, everybody's employed, there's no more capacity to increase output anymore. And at that point, any more money creation that is channeled to consumers will end up feeding into rising consumer prices. And this brings us then to the third and final broad class of borrowers, which is people who make goods and services, otherwise known as firms. When you lend money to firms, they can use that money to expand their production. Or if you lend money to, budding entrepreneurs, they can use that to set up new firms, which again will lead to an increase in goods and services being available to be bought by consumers. In this case, the amount of money in the economy is increasing in tandem with the amount of goods and services that are available to be bought with that money. And so what you would expect is for an increase in GDP without any increase in prices, because these two things are going up together. So back to that question, what determines whether an increase in the money supply flows into output or prices? Well, it's simple. Bank lending policies. Banks get to create new money, and they get to decide who gets that new money. So bank lending policies determine which of the three groups of borrowers that I've just outlined get the money. And that determines what happens next. So if they lend money to house buyers, house prices will go up. If they lend money to consumers, well, GDP can go up to a point, and then that can feed into consumer inflation if they're not careful. And if they lend money to firms, well, firms will increase the output of goods and services, and we won't get inflation. So what determines where the money's flowing to? Well, banks love lending mortgages. This is easy work for them. They just have to establish, do you have a good credit score? Does your salary cover the monthly payment on your mortgage? And does the value of the house cover the loan if we have to repossess it? If the answer to those three questions is yes, then thank you very much, Mr. Jones. Congratulations on your new home. We've approved your mortgage. Banks love consumer lending for the same reason. It's easy to do. Have you got a good credit score? Does your salary cover the monthly repayments on the loan? In that case, here's your new credit card, Mr. Jones. Enjoy going out and spending it. But banks don't really like lending to businesses. It's hard. It's risky. You go to a bank and you say, I've got this idea for a brilliant new product. Okay, it's widget 2.0. Everyone's going to love it. It's going to be a success. All I need is a couple of million to buy myself a nice factory premises, and another 2 million to buy the machinery and the tooling in order to produce the widget 2.0. And I just need another million on top of that so that I can buy some stock and I can hire some staff and I can get my marketing campaign going. So yeah, if you lend me 5 million quid, in a couple of years I'll be selling widget 2.0 like crazy. Everyone's going to love it. We're going to make loads of money. It's going to be great. The bank manager's going to say to you, well, Mr. Jones, you want me to lend you 5 million. What have I got for security on this loan? I've got an empty factory potentially, some machinery which I can auction off at a fraction of the price of what it was worth new. There's no security on this loan for me. 80 or 90% of businesses go bust within the first 3 years. I've got no guarantee that you're going to be able to pay me back that £5 million. Loan application denied. Get out of my office. Thanks very much. So when you look at how banks rationally respond to risk, yeah, they preference lending for mortgages. They preference consumer lending. And they're pretty reluctant to lend to businesses, especially new startups, which is why all the big new startups in America were backed by venture capital or private investors, not by banks. No wonder we have high house prices in Britain and a stagnant economy. So how do we explain the observation that the velocity of money has been falling? How do we sustain the argument that the quantity theory of money stacks up? Well, this comes down to how it's calculated, because we can't measure the velocity of money directly. We have to calculate it by measuring the quantity of money in the economy, the amount of goods and services that are traded, and also then what's going on with prices. And using those three quantities, we can calculate the velocity of money. The trouble is that we suffer from an illusion which is caused by not disaggregating the financial markets from the real economy. Just because the total amount of money has increased doesn't necessarily mean that the amount of money chasing goods and services has increased. If, for example, a lot of that new money has flown into financial markets and stayed there. And what we saw during the various episodes of QE, which were done between 2009 and 2013, well, quantitative easing was the process of the central bank creating new reserves and then using that new money to purchase financial assets from banks and other financial institutions. Well, this injected a whole load of new money into the financial markets. And what did we see as a result? Actually, during every episode of QE, we saw financial prices absolutely rocket. But none of this money was leaking out into the real economy. So none of this money was chasing real goods and services that ordinary people buy. So there was no increase in the output of goods and services, and there was no increase in the price of goods and services either, because all of that money was in financial markets chasing financial assets. So this has led some people to criticise QE as a policy and suggest that maybe next time round, instead of bailing out the banks, what we should do is something called people's QE, in which the central bank creates a load of money and gives it directly to the people. And those people will use that money to buy goods and services, which will keep firms afloat. And those firms will deposit that money in the banks, which will then indirectly bail out the banks. People's QE would bail out the people and the firms and the banks in the economy, rather than just creating new money and giving it to the banks and making people who own financial assets even wealthier. It's not a bad idea. So in summary, what determines if the money supply grows? Well, it's not interest rates. None of the above discussion did we mention interest rates. There is always demand for money. It's really useful stuff. So unless you push interest rates really high, which we did in the 1980s and in the early 1990s, unless you push rates really sky high, there's always people who want to borrow money. And if you want an example of this, just take a look around at credit card rates. A quick scan of the market will tell you that credit card rates are anywhere from 20% to 30% or more per annum. So you have to wonder just how high interest rates have to go before you scare off consumers. I think Keynes got this wrong. He just didn't understand how insensitive consumers are to interest rates. And it's not really surprising. When Keynes was writing, consumer credit wasn't such a big market. What determines if the money supply grows? Well, banks have complete control over their lending. What controls whether banks want to expand their lending or reduce it is simply the state of the economy. If the economy's going good guns, everyone's getting jobs, everyone's getting pay rises, then banks are going to go, brilliant, we'd love to lend you some money. Conversely, if there's a recession, if people are losing their jobs, if homes are getting repossessed, banks are going to go, whoa, we might not get repaid. We're going to rein in our lending right now. What determines bank lending is simply about risk. Period. It's banks managing their risk. Nothing to do with interest rates. What determines if output of goods and services grows? Well, if firms can get finance to expand and there's plenty of demand for their products, well, they will. But equally, if banks don't like lending to firms and firms can't get finance from elsewhere, if consumer lending drives up demand for their products, then eventually they may well make enough profits that they can finance expansion out of their profits. So consumer lending can still drive up growth. What determines if prices increase? Inflation. Well, for inflation to occur, the amount of money has to be growing faster than the amount of goods and services to be traded for that money. And as we saw during COVID, the government printed lots of money and distributed it out to people so that they could keep on spending even when they were on furlough. And at the same time, those lockdowns caused a reduction in the amount of goods and services available to be bought. So we had goods and services going down, but the amount of money being created actually went up. And what did we see? We saw that dislocation rapidly ended up in an explosion in prices. We ended up with a cost of living crisis that we all lived through, and it's hurt all of our real incomes. It's hurt our standard of living. Having lived through that, I don't think I have to sell this idea too hard. So is there a policy that can tame house prices and boost growth and keep consumer inflation down? Yes, there is, but it's not interest rates. It's called credit guidance. Now, credit guidance doesn't sever the link between growth and debt. It just directs debt to better uses. And credit guidance is simply the government via the central bank telling banks, okay, we want you to rein in your lending for mortgages. Well, that brings down house prices. We want you to rein in your lending for consumer credit, like credit cards and personal loans. Well, that brings down inflation. And we want you to increase your lending to firms. And by increasing the lending to firms, we're going to have an increase in the amount of GDP productive transactions. That will increase GDP, it will increase employment, but without any corresponding increase in inflation. Of course, debt in total is becoming problematic for the economy. And we might ask, well, how do we reduce the amount of debt? Because if all of our money is brought into existence as debt, and if we need monetary growth to have economic growth, then we're always going to end up with more debt. And we can't grow our way out of debt any more than you can grow your way out of your own head. So how do we have an economy that's successful and growing and everyone's doing well without everybody ending up in more and more debt? Well, that is a subject for another video. If you've listened to me this far, thank you very much. And I'll see you on the next one. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.